after attacking colored boarding houses, robbing them, and setting them on fire.
From 21st, the mob have just broken open gun store on 3rd Avenue and are arming.
The $300 man! Get him! Did your daddy buy you out of the army? Can he buy me out of the army too?
There is danger of mob attacking armory. From 18th Precinct, the mob have attacked the armory, 2nd Avenue, 21st Street. There is danger of firing the building.
All 300 police wounded or unaccounted for. Find the military.
Be it enacted that all able-bodied male citizens of the United States and persons of foreign birth who have become citizens between the ages of 20 and 45 years, except as hereinafter accepted, are hereby declared to constitute the national forces and shall be liable to perform military duty in the service of the United States when called out by the President for that purpose. It was these words stated in the Conscription Act of 1863 that provoked the racial discontent already present among many of New York City's white workers around the time of the Civil War. The act held that blacks would be exempted from the drafting, for they were not considered citizens. This angered many Democrats in the North, and in New York City, white workers came together to fight this injustice. They formed in mobs to attack blacks or black organizations associated with power, believing it necessary to protect their nation against takeover by this race. The riots dealt with the question of whose responsibility it was to give up their lives for the country, and whether or not the rights of the white workers were being marginalized by the government that seemed in favor of the African American or the wealthy.
They, of course, initially were taking to the streets in order to protest the fact that they, as poor Irishmen, were being drafted, and wealthier New Yorkers were not going to be drafted because either they were able to find a substitute, pay a substitute to take their place, or pay $300, which was the amount of money you could pay to get out of the draft. Well, the race riots then spread throughout the city, and it was extraordinarily destructive.
Before the draft riots began, lower-class white workers, especially the Irish, resented blacks because they felt they were in competition with their jobs. There was a great influx in the number of Irish and German immigrants in the United States in the middle of the 19th century. The Irish potato famine had sent many Irish from their homes into a land of new opportunity, America. This increase of immigrants caused competition for jobs to rise as more searched for similar jobs in the industrializing U.S. The political situation also helped to tighten the tension between these racial groups. With the Republican and abolitionist President Abraham Lincoln, many poor workers felt betrayed. To introduce more African Americans to the scene seemed preposterous. Yet, Lincoln's goal was to set free the slaves in the South. When he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, his intent became clear, and the poor workers, already struggling to find work, became even more riled. The northern, pro-slavery Democrats began to feel that American government was conspiring against them. When the drafting was issued, the white workers began to feel that the government now favored the blacks. At that time in the South, slaves were worth $1,000 each, whereas to be paid for taking someone's place in the war would earn you only $300. Both were, in a sense, selling one's life to another. By this comparison, African Americans were worth much more than the poor white worker. In addition, many of the workers who had immigrated to the United States but had taken the naturalization oath were being forced to enter the war for their new country and have the native-born recently freed slaves, supposedly not citizens, fill in their jobs while they were away.
The draft riots that took place in New York City, which were racially motivated riots, were not the only kind of racial unrest in the North in the period during the Civil War, leading up to and including the Civil War. You really need to pay attention to the fact that there was a lot of racial unrest even in the North at the time of the Civil War. Indeed, the North was far from unanimous about how to deal with African Americans.
On July 13, 1863, mobs began to riot throughout the streets of New York City. Consisting of mainly white working men, the mobs would burn down buildings due to the unfairness of the drafts. The governor of the city, Horatio Seymour, believed that the drafts were unfair and argued against them in court. However, this notion ended in defeat and the drafts continued to be pursued. The absence of trained soldiers due to the war gave the African Americans and the wealthy less protection. Additionally, rioters found strategic ways to prevent government intervention, cutting telegraph poles so that the news of the riots would not spread. Furious rioters burned down many buildings associated with African Americans, such as the Colored Orphan Asylum, which housed over 200 children and represented white charity towards blacks. The children were led to safety, but they still had witnessed the angry mobs race in to throw their beds into disarray and steal their clothes and food. A helpless onlooker noted that if there was a man among them with a heart within him to come and help these poor children, the mob laid hold of him and appeared ready to tear him to pieces.
The draft riots themselves were just extraordinarily vicious and destructive. I mean, it brought out the worst in the rioters.
Mobs found many ruthless ways to attack. Often they simply burned houses and destroyed property owned by African Americans or multiracial families. The rioters also took time to mutilate the bodies of innocent blacks. One man was dragged through the streets and hung from a lamppost. After this, another rioter untied him and pulled him down and dragged him across the street by his genitals. These kinds of torments were surprisingly well accepted by many white onlookers. When one man was being beaten, a crowd merely watched in awed silence. Very few slipped away to notify authorities. The rioters also attacked the wealthy because of the class injustice. The riots in the central part of the city spurred some Irish dock workers on the shore of New York to begin their own riots. The Longshoremen Union was comprised of many Irish workers who were upset, like poor whites elsewhere, that the black citizens were occupying so many of their jobs. Since the 1850s, many of the white dock workers had been disdainful of the African Americans due to their seeming takeover of jobs. And by 1863, longshoremen came together to attack around 200 of their fellow African American dock workers. One man was beaten and nearly drowned by an angry mob. Another, while trying to escape from Brooklyn, was beaten until he was unconscious, then thrown into New York's East River. Their intent was to destroy all signs of black social life, and they burned dance halls, tenements, and boarding houses that catered to African Americans. While the riots were spreading, the New York City police officers were the only available means of defense to suppress them, since the state militia was off fighting in the war. However, the power of the mobs was overwhelming, and the police were forced to retreat. Police Superintendent John A. Kennedy was left unconscious with massive injuries when a mob brutally attacked him. After the Confederates were defeated at Gettysburg, the Republicans heard about this outrage and they sent Robert E. Lee along with a multitude of soldiers to go and end the rioting. With the arrival of the soldiers and Marines at New York Harbor, rioters were suppressed. Soldiers assigned to New York City were finally able to quell the draft riots after 5 days. Nonetheless, the riots changed the atmosphere of the society in New York City. The African American population decreased, and security in New York City was tightened. Working men, who before could not afford substitutes, were given some, and the draft quota for them decreased. Drafting continued peacefully, and blacks were able to fight in the army, which gave them some rights. Although change for blacks was coming, issues of racism and black freedom was still prominent in the nation. These violent riots were the result of anxiety many poor immigrant workers felt around the time of the Civil War. Often, white workers interpreted the movement to free the slaves in the South as a way of increasing the African American rights in exchange for their own, and to lower their already low status. Because the Conscription Act could exclude blacks from the drafting, many Irish workers knew there needed to be a major change. The immigrant jobs were being taken because they had to go off and fight in the war. They made this injustice clear with their violent rioting, and the government was forced to establish a more consistent drafting policy so that people of a certain race or class could not be discriminated against. The draft riots ensued because white workers saw that they were losing their rights as African American workers and the wealthy class expanded. This no longer seemed an equal society, and thus they felt it their responsibility to fight to regain their social stature.